Good evening, everyone. I'm so sorry this evening. I'm currently preaching in a little chapel on the edge of my steg, but I wanted to try and help out with the second part of this ladies' teaching event. Now, I know that the aim of this evening is all about how do we actually prepare a talk based on Bible verses and passages from Scripture. And for your homework, you had to look at preparing a talk based on the subject of joy in the Christian life. Well, because I'm grumpy old Scrooge, I thought I'd go for the complete opposite of joy and look at how I would prepare a talk based on the topic of suffering. So that's what I'm going to look at in this short time that we have together. When I'm preparing a talk based on a theme as opposed to a specific passage, one of the techniques I like to use is try and ask some questions related to that theme. So the theme is suffering. I would then break that down into 3 questions. So I would perhaps think about the origin of suffering. Where does suffering come from? Does it have a source? I would then want to look at the purpose of suffering, because we as Christians believe that actually there is a purpose to suffering. God is working through the suffering. And then I'd say, is there hope beyond the suffering? And we'd look at what the Bible has to say about that. So I really like to have the kind of question and answer approach, and then look at different Bible verses that relate to each of the questions. And it just gives the audience something to hang on. There's a good structure to it. People know where they are, and it can be quite engaging that way. So that's one way that I would look at how to prepare a talk in that sense. I would then think about, who am I talking to? What's the audience in front of me? Because you would pitch a talk in a different way depending on the audience. Are they Christian? Are they non-Christian? Is it a mixture of Christian and non-Christian? What's the age range? What's their attention span? How long are they expecting the talk to be? Because that's going to determine how many points you have or how many different things you can deal with if you've only got 10 minutes compared to 45 minutes. Some places that you go to, they will be expecting a good long talk. Some will be nice and short. So you've got to know your audience when it comes to that. You then need to think about the tone that you set in the way that you talk. So, for instance, if we're dealing with the topic of suffering, we need to be sensitive because it is a difficult topic. There will be people in the audience who are going through extreme suffering as they're listening to you. And there'll be people who have dealt with horrible things in their past. So we need to be sensitive to that and yet faithful to what the Bible says on the topic. So we want to be sensitive but faithful to God's word. So once you've got your questions, the next thing to do is to go and find all the relevant Bible verses. So you do not need to have an amazing Bible knowledge to do this. Thanks to Google, you can put the search in, so you could put Bible verses on suffering. It'll come up with loads. And then what you want to do is try and sort the Bible verses so that they match your questions. So you might look at all the ones that deal with the origin of suffering. You might then look at the passages that deal with the purpose for suffering. And then you'd look at the Bible passages that talk about hope beyond the suffering. So that's what we'll look at now in the time we have. So the first question is the origin of suffering. And I would then go to passages such as Genesis chapter 3, where we see the fall and the beginning of suffering entering into the world. We'd look at Romans chapter 5, which talk about when sin came into the world, death came into the world, and therefore the inference is that suffering came as a consequence of the fall. So that would be the kind of the look at the origin of the suffering. But then we'd go to the purpose of the suffering. So even though there's suffering in this world, God can still use this suffering to achieve incredible things. So I've got a couple of passages that we'll go to. The first one is 1 Peter chapter 4, verses 12 to 16. So let's have a look at this together. Peter writes, "Beloved, do not be surprised at the fiery trial when it comes upon you to test you, as though something strange were happening to you. But rejoice insofar as you share Christ's sufferings, that you may also rejoice and be glad when his glory is revealed. If you are insulted for the name of Christ, you are blessed, because the Spirit of glory and of God rests upon you. But let none of you suffer as a murderer or a thief or an evildoer or as a meddler." In other words, there's no benefit to suffering for being a bad person. Yet if anyone suffers as a Christian, Let him not be ashamed, but let him glorify God in that name. So when we suffer as a Christian, we are glorifying God. And when we see this passage, we see that we shouldn't be surprised when we suffer. It's not something that should take us aback, as if it's something new. No, we are sharing in Christ's suffering, and therefore we share in his blessings as well. So when we suffer for Christ, we should not be ashamed. When we think of the worst suffering that has ever taken place in this world, it happened to Christ on the cross. He experienced the worst suffering possible. And we get to, in one sense, get the privilege of suffering with him as we build his kingdom. So we should not be surprised when we experience suffering. Jesus himself said, look, if you want to follow me, you need to take up your cross and follow me. It's not going to be an easy road. I then go to Romans chapter 5, verses 3 to 4, which read, not only so, but we also glory in our sufferings. Now that is weird, isn't it? We glory in our sufferings. Why? Because we know that suffering produces something. It produces perseverance. We have to keep on going through our suffering. It's hard, but we persevere. And perseverance, character. And character, hope. So there is a purpose in that God is teaching us to cling to him. When we're in the hard times, we cling to Christ, and he helps us to grow and mature as believers. And we see this in James chapter 1, verses 2 to 4 as well, where it says, consider it pure joy, my brothers and sisters, whenever you face trials of many kinds, because you know that the testing of your faith produces perseverance. Let perseverance finish its work so that you may be mature and complete, not lacking anything. So in those passages we see the purpose of suffering is that it is refining us as believers. It's maturing us so we're becoming more like Christ. It's a little bit like how they purified gold. Now if you want to purify gold to get rid of all the impurities, you melt it down and all the impurities rise to the top, and then they are skimmed off, leaving you with pure gold. And that's a little bit like when we go through sufferings. It's putting us into the fire to burn away all the stuff that shouldn't be there. So what's left over after the trial, after the temptation, is a mature faith in Jesus Christ. So that's a little bit then about what the purpose of suffering is. But is there any hope beyond the suffering? And then I'd go to a couple of passages which I'll show you here. The first one is in 2 Corinthians chapter 4, verse 17. And this reads, for our light and momentary troubles, so all our suffering, are achieving for us an eternal glory. There's an eternal reward for those who endure beyond the suffering. And this eternal glory far outweighs them all. And in Romans chapter 8, verse 18, it says, I consider that our present sufferings, now this is Paul, by the way, who wrote this, Paul, who knew exactly what it was to suffer. Paul says, I consider that our present sufferings are not worth comparing with the glory that will be revealed in us. So here, Paul is describing our sufferings as light and momentary. Now, is he trivializing our suffering? I don't think so. Paul knew exactly what it was to suffer. But he's saying that the reward for it is so good that it'll seem that our suffering was almost insignificant in comparison to the weight of glory that we can expect beyond the grave. He's trying to give us a different perspective on our suffering. He's kind of saying, well, even if you have to suffer for the next 40, 50, 60, 70 years, and it's the worst suffering you could imagine, that's going to seem like nothing compared to eternity and that joy and hope that we have in Jesus Christ. So yes, there is hope beyond our suffering. And we see this in Revelation chapter 21, verse 4, where we see the end to our suffering. It says, he will wipe away every tear from their eyes. There will be no more death or mourning or crying or pain, for the old order of things has passed away. So yeah, there is hope beyond that suffering. There will be a day where every tear is wiped from our eyes, and there'll be no more sadness, no more mourning, no more death, or no more pain. There is that incredible hope beyond our suffering. So that's how I would go about structuring the talk. I would start off by looking at some questions that I try and answer. So the origin of suffering, the purpose of suffering, and is there any hope beyond the suffering? I'd then find all the relevant Bible verses, sort them into the right categories, and then use the Bible verses to answer the questions. And I hope that's perhaps a helpful model for how to prepare a talk on a biblical theme. I hope you enjoy the rest of your evening. Thanks everyone. Take care.
Okay, so for the first time tonight is all about how you communicate and apply the message. And so the first, I guess what we're going to do, we're looking at the big picture stuff first of all. Once we've got the big picture stuff in our minds, right, that will help to construct better the more detailed aspects of putting a message together, okay? So the first place we start is the big idea. So what we have to ask is, what is it all about? For those of you who have been involved so far in speaking or leading house groups, have you ever had moments where you've been speaking and you've thought to yourself, I have no idea what I'm talking about right now? You had those moments? Honestly?
No.
No, never? Okay, those of you who are listeners and maybe not had the opportunity to speak, or all of us now, have you ever had moments when you're listening to preaching, maybe here, it could be me, obviously not, but it could be me, and you've been thinking, I have no idea what he's talking about now. Yeah, well, you're nodding more about that one, thank you. But, so that talks about the importance of having the big idea really clear in your mind. What is it all about? And so here's a sentence for you which is quite useful. When you've worked through complexity to arrive at simplicity, you've achieved understanding. So what you might have found this week, you kind of get into the crux of your message. You're maybe researching, looking at YouTube videos, making notes. Like sometimes I can go really deep, reading commentaries and lots of websites and so on, putting it all down. So I've got pages and pages of stuff. And I start the week thinking I've got a clear idea of where I'm going. By the end of the week, I'm all over the shop. It's just a total mess because I've just got so much information and I don't know what to do with the information. I don't know how to structure the information and I get a bit lost. We just can't preach if we're in that state. I heard this once and it's been really, really helpful to me, that if someone were to ask you a question the day before you were about to preach, speak or whatever, somewhere, and the question was, what is your message all about? Could you answer that question in one sentence? If you can't answer that question in one sentence before you're about to preach, you're not ready to preach. Just has to have that aspect of clarity right so that you know what your purpose is. The big idea is. If you don't know what the big idea is, people will be listening and thinking, I have no idea what he or she is on about right now. So clarity right from the word go is so, so important. You have to have a big idea. And every message will have one big idea, and it'll have lots of things, right? But all the other things will be subsidiary to that idea, will feed into that idea. And so you'll have one subject heading. So if someone says to you, what's your message about? It's about how you face suffering in how you go through suffering and still remain joyful. Maybe something like that. But you may have 3 points that feed into that main point, like James had then. The clarity of the big idea is where you start. Okay, what you also need clarity on is the purpose of the message. So that's asking the question, or answering the question, what's my aim? So you need to think to yourself, okay, I can give a load of information in this message. Great. I could get to the end where people will say, well done, did a really good job, communicated that well, learned so much. But then that's really not the aim. The aim is change. The aim is you want to make a difference by what you're saying. If you get to the end of the message and people are left thinking, I don't know what to do, I don't really know what that was about, then the purpose of the message has been lost. So you need to be thinking as you're preparing and as you're speaking it then, what do I want people to do? Do I want people to become more holy? Do I want people to live a life that's more worshipful? Do I want people to be more motivated to evangelize? Do I want people to be helped to be more patient in the house? So you've got a big idea. It's about this. And then this is what I wanted to achieve in people's lives. So important. They're the kind of the big picture questions. You okay so far? Mm-hmm. Okay. Let's move on. So in terms of like the stuff that's going into your message now, in terms of what we need to think through and content-wise, you need to aim for information, transformation, and worship. They're three of the things that you want to achieve in your message. First thing is information. So you kind of want people to leave saying to themselves, that's interesting, and I need to believe and remember that. People like information. People like to hear stuff that they've not heard before that they find interesting. I remember when we started the church here, and I came from a church that was rich in teaching and doctrine. Big emphasis, truth, right? But I had a real problem with that because it was a church that loved the truth, gloried in the truth, but did nothing with the truth. And so when we started in Baglan, I kind of did a pendulum swing. It's like, we can't just have lots and lots of truth. That's pointless if we're not doing anything. So we simplify everything. We do the real basic, and we just do the simple things. But then I kind of had to shift back a little bit because I realized that people were sort of saying, it's kind of not enough. It's not deep enough. We're hearing the same things over and over. We need content. And that makes sense because when you think about Romans 12 verse 2, what's Romans 12 verse 2? So this is another thing that to be a preacher, you've got to learn these verses, these really key verses. So you really need to know your Bible. So Romans 12 verse 2, don't be conformed to the pattern of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind, right? And so we are transformed when we renew our minds. We renew our minds through information. We're getting information put into us all day, every day by the world. And so the church will need to hear information, truth to believe and to act on in order to be transformed. So this is kind of like the base level. It has to start with information. So you need to have a good level of interesting content in your message. That's the first thing. Second thing, you need to think about transformation as well. So like we said with the purpose of the message, it has to lead with a change in a person's life. And so if your message doesn't affect a person's life in any way, shape or form, it may have failed in its purpose. So you're looking for transformation. So people need to be then thinking at the end of the message, okay, I need to change and I know what I need to do. That needs to be the kind of the outcome of your message. People thinking, right, I know what I need to change and I know how to do it now. So people generally need help with that. Again, have you ever heard a message that may have been rich in content, but then you've come away thinking, he didn't apply any of that. There was no application whatsoever. So it was interesting, but I kind of came away thinking, I just don't know what to do now. And sometimes I think preachers can imagine, I just put the content out there and people will know what to do with it. But generally we don't. And we're sitting and we're listening in real time, and it's just not enough time to really think through what do we do. So part of your message will have to have information about, okay, this is what you need to do now. And this is also kind of the ABC of how you go about, as simply as I can, explain to you how you do that. So that leads then to transformation. But I guess there's another layer as well. So information, transformation, but also worship. You see, again, if it's just information and transformation, that won't be enough. The problem with that is it may lead to one of two outcomes for people. So you just told someone, okay, this is what you need to do, this is what Scripture says, and this is how you do it. And people will go home then, and one or two things will happen. Either, if it's a really good message, they'll be enthusiastic, And they'll go away and they'll start to do it and they feel great about it. But then at some point they'll get distracted. At some point they'll get tempted and they'll fall and fail and they'll feel awful and they'll probably feel really condemned because they failed. That's one outcome. Another outcome could be they've actually gone away and done it really well because they're great at doing things really well. They're great at doing church things. They're great at doing ministry. And so they're really good at putting into action what you've just told them. But that could lead, without the gospel, to pride. They're the kind of the two outcomes that can happen if all we give people is a moral message and what they need to do. Either condemnation or pride. And so what you need to do is you need to take them also to the gospel. Because even the Christian life is about the gospel, right? So first of all, you point to Jesus. And in Jesus, you find actually he's probably going to be your best example of what you're trying to achieve. If you're looking at joy, Jesus will exemplify it more than anyone. If you're looking at going through suffering, Jesus will exemplify it. If you're looking at obedience, Jesus will be the best example. Almost anything you can think of, in principle, you look at the life of Jesus, he'll example it perfectly for you to finish off, right? But also when you go to the cross, you help people to realize a couple of things. First of all, you realize again that actually I can't contribute anything. When I got saved, I was dependent on Jesus. I don't bring anything to the table. In my Christian life, I don't bring anything to the table. So it's not about me. I just need Jesus. That eliminates pride, right? Also, when we go to the cross, we realize that there's a Savior who died for us to be forgiven. So our identity is not in our performance and our behavior, but in what Jesus has done for us. That eliminates condemnation. And so we need to take people from just transformation to the point where they get to, Jesus is amazing. He's the best example. He died for me to be forgiven. And he enables me to live the Christian life by faith. The life I live by faith in the Son of God who loved me and gave himself for me. Information, transformation, worship. Cool. Okay. Illustrations, stories, and quotations. In your groups, discuss amongst yourselves what are the benefits of stories, illustrations, and quotations. Okay, so as Stuart Ollie had said once, for each point, it can be really helpful to think, state it, illustrate it, apply it. So you're going through the Bible text, you're explaining it, you're stating the point you want to make, right? You do that first of all. That's abstract truth. Then you illustrate it. You make it more clear. You make it more memorable. Then you apply it. And you do that for each point you make. That's just a simple way of thinking about how do you work out each point. State it, illustrate it, apply it. State, illustrate, apply. It's quite memorable as well, right? Where do you get illustrations from? Where would you get stories, illustrations, and so on from? Without looking at the screen.
The Bible.
The Bible, yeah, absolutely. Do you know? There's loads of really good illustrations and stories in the Bible. Yeah.
Preachers? Like, so...
From what other preachers have used, yeah, absolutely.
Your own experiences?
Your own experiences in life, brilliant, yeah. Do you know, that's harder when you're a preacher in a church week after week. You run out of your own stories. That's the only problem with that one. What else, guys? Anything else you can think of? So stories you make up as well, yeah? So it don't have to be your stories. They can be like, how am I going to illustrate that now? And what you might be able to do is come up with some kind of story that fits that thing you're trying to talk about. But it could be a made-up story or example, right? There are websites. I came across one years ago called sermonillustrations.com. It's pretty good because it's free. A lot of sites will charge you if you want to have the full illustration or story. But again, yeah, you can search for them online and find good illustrations. Can you think of any others? I think I'm out now with that. Stories in the news, contemporary stuff that's going on that you can talk about.
Like Christians from the past, their biographies?
Their biographies, yeah, brilliant. Yeah, so Bible biographies, Christian biographies. It's good. Okay, so illustrations, really, really important. State it, illustrate it in some way, and apply it. Okay, let's talk about the importance of good structure. Let's do an open discussion now. Why is good structure important in a message?
Keep your audience. If you're all over the place, you lose your audience.
You do, don't you? Yeah, we've all been listening to sermons before where we thought, where on earth is he going? I have no idea where he's going right now. And again, if you are not clear in your prep with regard to your structure, people listening to you will be completely lost because they don't know where you're going. And you might think, oh, it's not that important, they can still listen, but they really can't. Once the audience has lost your train of thought, where you're heading, the logic of what you're presenting, they'll switch off because they'll be thinking, I just don't know where we're going. And they won't be able to listen to the rest of the message very well at all. So structure is really, really important, and your clarity in the structure. So here's a basic structure for you. So it's kind of like a symmetrical structure where you've got an introduction and a conclusion. And in the middle, I don't know how it really works, but 3 points really work. Last week I had 2 and today I had 6. So it's not always the case. but generally, and there's a kind of a symmetry of 3 points as well. But your message might take that kind of shape. So your introduction would introduce your message, right? So you begin your message and you want to tell people what it's about and why they're going to enjoy it and benefit from it. You see, you want to grab people from the very start. And so you say, okay, so my message is about this, and this is why it's going to be relevant to you. So instantly people are thinking then, okay, that's good. I'm going to enjoy that because that's going to be relevant to my life. That's really what your introduction is all about. Short, but telling people, this is where we're heading, this is why it's relevant for you. Then you've got the body of the message, which may be 3 points. For each point, state it, illustrate it, apply it, and then you make a conclusion. Your conclusion is kind of, let's bring it all together. Let me just recap briefly. You don't want to go through it all in detail again, that would be a killer for people. But in a sentence or two, you recap what your main points are, and then you drive home what the application is again, how you want people to respond and point into Jesus and the gospel. That will be a general outline for you every time you put a message together, with subtle variations on the number of points. Any comments on that in terms of structure?
If you were to watch a YouTube video, the first 5 minutes
Yeah.
tell you if you're going to want to watch the whole thing or not.
Yeah,
so it's the
yeah.
same with the sermon. But
Yeah.
the first 5-10 minutes is going to tell you whether you want to listen or not.
Yeah. No, that's true. You know, on sabbatical, I read this phrase from a book on preaching that, and he said, in your introduction, people will decide whether you're the kind of preacher they can't listen to, or the kind of preacher they can listen to, or the kind of preacher they must listen to. And I thought to myself, I want to be that preacher that people think, I must listen to this. That's what you're aiming for, right? Okay, the art of communication. Now, hang on, let's get rid of that. Let's have a discussion. So while we have a discussion, feel free to get a drink. Last week, part of your homework was, what are the kind of things that keep your attention when you're listening to a sermon being preached? What are the kind of things where you lose attention? So the good aspects about sermons and preaching, the bad aspects about sermons and preaching. Share your conclusions or even talk about what your feelings are on that subject now for about 5 or 6 minutes. Okay? Okay, so let's go through some of these things then. Okay, so generally, guys, you've got to remember that you're delivering a monologue, okay? Now, you just got to think, if you were in conversation with somebody and they talked to you, at you, for 10 minutes, just 10 minutes, you would be bored, wouldn't you, by the end of 10 minutes? Because it's hard. In conversation, you've got to be taking part in conversations, otherwise you lose interest. Imagine listening to somebody in a conversation talking to you for 20 minutes or for 30 minutes without giving you an opportunity to talk back. You'd be wanting to pull your hair out, scratch your eyes out, whatever. So you've just got to think, you're doing a monologue. And so you've got to think, I've got to do it in such a way, I've got to communicate it in such a way that I grab people's attention and I keep people's attention for the whole length of my message. Maybe you want to start off, as you're starting off, by not being too ambitious, right? So if you've not done it before, or if you're not confident, it may not be a good idea to think, I'm going to do a 30-minute or 40-minute message. That might be a recipe for disaster. I would, if it's your first time, start short and just think, can I get a message for 10 minutes and keep people's attention for 10 minutes? And then maybe work at it as you go on. So that's what you've got to think. It's a monologue, and so you need to think, I'm going to really need to work hard at my communication in order to keep it interesting for the entire time. So, some of the things that you can do and think about, you've mentioned some of them. Ask questions. Why is it useful to ask questions? What happened when I asked that question then?
You engage with people.
It makes you think, or almost like puts you on the spot. Oh, he's asked a question. Might he ask me the question? It gets you alert. It gets you thinking about the subject matter that the person is talking about. So in your message, rhetorically, you can ask a question. Okay, what do you think that verse is talking about there? So you're making people think about that verse rather than passively maybe sitting back. So asking questions about what you're talking about as you go through can be a good way of engaging people. Next, use lots of expression. Okay, those of you who have preached or you've spoken in various meetings, have you ever watched yourself back on the video or listened to yourself? Have you ever done that? What did you think when you listened to yourself back? I can see you shaking your head. Can I tell you, I don't watch myself back, but when I have done, I'm always surprised at my lack of expression. So when you're speaking, I think you imagine that you can be over the top with it. It's like, oh gosh, was I over the top or whatever? Was it too much? Was it too melodramatic? You listen to it back and you think, oh my gosh, I'm boring. I'm slower than I thought I was. I'm not as expressive as I thought I was. So when you're speaking, I promise you, when you start speaking, you'll think that you're expressive. You are not going to be expressive enough. You need to almost think to yourself, I need to really be energetic and put loads of almost exaggerated expression in to keep people's attention. Otherwise, it won't be enough expression. What I used to do when I used to go out preaching before we started in Baglan, I would go visiting places. And particularly when my mood wasn't right, I would think, I've got to get my mood right. I've got to get my energy levels right. I would stick on Beethoven's Fifth Symphony and I would listen till I'd be driving. Da-na-na-na. And by the time I got to the church, I'd be up for it, you know. So you've really, the energy levels, expression levels have to be there. Some of you talked about earlier variety. So if you shout all the time, that's not going to work. If you're quiet all the time, that's not going to work. If you're really slow and pondering all the time because you think it sounds profound, it's okay for a while, but after a while it's like, oh, come on, wind it up. And so it's variety, isn't it? It's sometimes a bit faster, sometimes slow it down to make a point, sometimes loud, and then sometimes you're just more winsome and you're more quiet. And so it's variety of expression and doing far more than you imagine that you need to do, because it's monologue, not conversation. So you have to be dynamic and you have to be interesting. Does that make sense? Yeah. But here, listen, but this is where we need to think as well. Like, let's not put too much pressure on ourselves. There are some preachers that are just amazing and they're naturally brilliant communicators. All of us will have a particular level. We're just working to get to the ceiling of our level, right? As good as we possibly can be. We're not going to all be amazing Billy Graham-like communicators, are we? Okay, that's use lots of expression. Next, get a good balance between reading and being extemporary. So like, I'm making eye contact. Okay, so, Right, well, I guess what we're talking about here, I don't know if you've ever had a go at doing this, how naturally you found delivering a message. But I think what you need to avoid is just reading. You may start off there, right? But I think you want to move away from just reading a script to being at least in part extemporary. And I think kind of like natural, just talking, not using the notes, all right? So I'm not saying something I've memorized word for word. I'm not reading something I've memorized word for word. I'm talking kind of an off the top of my head, extemporary way. So I know what I'm going to say because I've prepared it, but I'm being extemporary in the way I deliver it, and I'm looking at people. Now, if you get preachers who will just be like this the whole time, lack of expression is more likely to send a listener to sleep. You must be animated, passionate, and expressive. Have moments when you are louder, quieter. You're not going to listen to someone's preaching like that, are you? Even if they put expression in, lack of expression is more likely to send a listener to sleep. You must be animated, passionate, and expressive. Have moments. That's better. But still, you want a preacher to engage you, to be looking at you. You get these other preachers, I don't know if you've noticed them, they kind of look into the middle distance. Lack of expression is really going to lose your audience. And you look at them and you think, like, who are they preaching to? Like the spider on the wall, or are they delivering some kind of Shakespearean sonnet or whatever? And so even if it's like a congregation of 2,000, 3,000, you've got to look at times at your congregation, at the audience, so that they know you're looking at faces and they feel like you're kind of engaging with them. And again, communication is engaging. You've used that word, so you've got to engage with your audience. Here's what I would recommend, okay? So you want to get a balance between what you read and then being extemporary, getting out of your notes and engaging more naturally. You're looking for natural, right? More naturally rather than, oh flip, I sound like I'm reading. And anybody in one sense can read, right? And so what I would do to get a balance is, remember I spoke before about state it, illustrate it, apply it. For the stated part, that's generally the most difficult part to be extemporary. Because you're looking at text, you're trying to explain the text, you need to be more precise with what you say, with the words that you use, because you really don't want to step up and say things that are theologically correct or get it all wrong. And you want to be really clear with abstract truth to start with. So I would say that when you're stating it in your point, that's probably the bit where you're more reading and stuck in the text, okay? But then you get to the illustration. This is going to be your best bet for being free of your notes, because you're talking about a story or an example from your life or something in the news or whatever it is, right? You still have to work at memorizing it. You may have some kind of bullet points, but there's your opportunity. I'm telling a story. I can learn this story and I can communicate this part in a more natural way to people. And then maybe the application as well, I don't know, if you can be free of your notes for that, that would be great, but you may need to go back to the notes a little bit more for that. Does that make sense in terms of what might work for you when you come to prepping? But it's getting the right balance, I suppose, between reading and being extemporary and making eye contact. Practice. You really need to practice before you speak. A real danger is, and you find it with people who give their testimony, you find it with people who give speeches in weddings, is that they'll write it and they'll imagine that because it's come from their head and they've written it down on paper, that they're okay. Then they get to it and they're about to read it and they're like, oh my gosh, I feel like I've blanked. And they start and they've realised that they're stumbling over their words and they don't know where they're going and so on. Because you've got to practice it, you really have. And when you practice it, you find out how ready you really are. So what you do is, okay, you've written it up, you've got the clarity of all your points, and we'll talk about that in a minute in terms of the detail of what you put in. But then you've got to think, okay, I need to put myself in a position of, if I'm going to be speaking at the ladies' meeting or whatever, how is that going to go? I've got one shot, right? I'm going to start talking. I can't stop. I can't kind of go, oh, hang on, where am I? Oh, what was I about to say? Oh, let's just think about this again. You can't do that. You've just, in that one shot, got to deliver your 10 minutes or 20 minutes or whatever. So put yourself in that situation and start doing it. And as you start doing it, you'll find out, oh my goodness, I'm not as clear as I thought I was. I don't really know what I'm saying there. I don't know where I'm going. That doesn't sound right. Now I'm trying to communicate to the people. They're not going to get what I'm saying there. And it's that kind of thing. I'm stumbling over my words. How do I say that? And when you're practicing it, and you'll have to do it several times, you'll discover actually that there's still lots you've got to get sorted out. And so honestly, you've got to practice it over and over. So what I do, I prep on the sort of the start of the week, I finish towards the end of the week, and then on Saturday night and Sunday morning, I go through it and I speak it to myself. So family will often walk into the room when I'm like, who are you talking to? What are you on the phone to? And I'm just practicing my sermon. And then last minute on a Sunday morning, I practice it so it's fresh in my head. And so...
The worst thing about that is when you laugh at your own jokes.
Yeah.
You just hear him say this sermon and then he starts laughing.
Yeah, that happens. Okay, so what I do, so I look for a high degree of clarity in my mind with regard to what I'm going to be saying, so that even if I had no notes, I would probably be able to deliver most of the message, right? And the more clarity you guys can get, the better. And so what I would do is like you start the week, or whatever you do, start whatever you're prepping, you kind of the idea of where you're going. And then you put all your kind of information together and all the content there, and then it's like, oh man, it's a lot now. Then you've got to figure out, right, how am I going to make this more simple? How am I going to get the structure right? What stuff am I going to leave out because it's way too long, whatever it is. And then you're left then with, I guess, your structure. What I would do is I would have my clarity of this is what it's about. I'd have my intro, my points, and my conclusion. I would write it out in full. So all my messages I write out in full in preparation. So I know exactly what I want to say. It may be different on the morning when it's extemporary, but it's all out in full. But then before I preach, I would have the clarity in my mind of exactly where I'm heading. So like before I preached this morning, I knew that I was going to be starting off by talking about just some stuff in the previous chapter where it talks about false conversions of Simon the sorcerer. So I thought, I want to start first of all by saying what a false Christian is, what a false conversion is. Then I knew I was going to be reading the text after having explained, right, this is where we're heading. And then I would talk first of all about why the conversion of Paul was actually great evidence for the authenticity of Christianity. And then I'd have my 6 points. My 6 points would be clearer in my head. So I know, okay, so this is about the characteristics of conversion. My first point is going to be it's limitless. Second point, it's illuminating. Third point, powerful. Fourth point, mercy. Illuminate. So power. Hang on, it's gone now. Limitless, powerful, illuminating, merciful, gentle, sudden, and not sudden. And even within those, I'd have an idea in my head of, see if I came to a sermon and I thought, right, I'm going to be talking about how it's limitless. And if I got to a Sunday morning, I was thinking, oh, what was I going to say about that now? What does it mean? That would throw me. So I would need to know as well, if I'm saying that it's limitless, I know what points I'm making. I even kind of have an idea in my head what my illustration is going to be and where I'm going in terms of the application. So it's all there, ready. My notes just trigger that for me. And so sometimes people will say, how can you do it without notes or whatever? It's like, it's practice. It's not like a natural ability thing to some extent. Honestly, it's going over it and getting it as clear as you possibly can. So by the time that you deliver your message, you're as on it and as confident about it and as clear about what you want to say and where you're going and what the purpose is and so on before you deliver it. And there's kind of no get out from lots and lots of hard work, really. Okay, and then lastly, before we do a little bit of Greek, just a little bit of Greek. Lastly, welcome feedback. It's the toughest thing. So I don't know whether you're going to be objective about how good you are. I think I am, because I can really tell when I've preached and I think that was just dreadful. I just know. And people do help you, because on a Sunday morning for me, it's like you get it, because some people will say that was great. When you're really bad, no one says anything. Sometimes they avoid you at the door as well and walk past you because they really don't want to have to say anything, because nobody wants to lie, do they? Yeah. But you kind of know often when you're bad or when it's good. But I would welcome feedback. So when you start speaking in the meetings and so on, pretty much everybody will be encouraging. They'll say, "Well done. Yeah, that was really good. You did a great job." There won't be many that will kind of say, "You know, I only spoke for 10 minutes, it's a bit boring." Nobody will say that, will they? So, but what I would really encourage you to do, if it gets recorded, I don't know if you watch the recording, but if not, just ask somebody who you know will be honest with you and say, "Please, will you be honest with me? Tell me, what was it that I could improve? You know, was it clear?" Think about some of these points and go through them almost like, did you know what my main point was? Was it engaging? I really want you to be honest with me. And it's tough to get that level of feedback because we're so insecure when we do things like this. It's almost, you're putting yourself out there and I'm still insecure to some extent, many years on. And like, even if you do one message that works and it's kind of okay, even the next week, it's like, I could mess up and you're kind of only as good as your last sermon in one sense. So welcome feedback if you can. But also, and we finish with this, just remember, it really isn't about you. And I think sometimes when we do all of this, and you know, it's understandable because you get to the point where it's like, I just want to be able to get my sermon together and communicate it for people to be able to say, that was good. That's kind of job done. But that's really just about me doing okay. It's got to be more than that, isn't it? Ultimately, it's about you delivering a message so that people will benefit and their lives will be better and Jesus is glorified. Do you know, I was going to say I get the occasional message. I get more than the occasional message, but you know when you bomb sometimes, and it's honestly, it's one of the worst experiences in the world where, and it's sometimes inexplicable how it happens, where you can be speaking and your mind goes blank, you don't feel comfortable, you're not on top of your material, for whatever reason it is, you just feel dreadful afterwards. But then almost immediately I say to myself, okay, at least that's humbling me now and telling me that it's not about me. And guys, so if that can free you and release you a little bit at the end of it all, it's about Jesus. It's not about whether you are good at speaking or not. It's about Jesus. All right, just a little bit of Greek. Firstly, if you do look into Hebrew and you're looking at Hebrew text reads from right to left. Yeah. We read from left to right, yeah? And Greek does. But if you do get to that kind of level, you're trying to read Hebrew, you're going to have to go from the right-hand side of the page through to the left-hand side of the page.
I thought you were having a laugh here, right?
No. And Hebrew is far more difficult, I think, really, to get your head around and to look at than Greek, unless you read somebody who says this is what this Hebrew word means. But I like it myself. You might want to do it yourself. So if I'm reading the Bible and I come across a verse, and there are different translations translate the verse differently, and I'm reading the NIV or whatever, and I'm like, oh, not sure I like that translation. And then the ESV does it differently, and the AV does it differently, or whatever. It's like, so what is the original Greek there? I want to know sometimes. And sometimes when I listen to someone else preaching, I'll be there, and I'll be going on this website and trying to find out what the actual Greek is. And sometimes you can check out preachers as well, because preachers can misuse the knowledge of Greek to say what perhaps the text doesn't say. So I like this website works for me. It might work for you. So it's called BibleHub.com. I think it was on your first notes last week. Okay? So basically, so I'm on a page already. This wouldn't be the page you come to when you open it up. It would be this page. And so what you would do then, you would go to the text that you were looking at. So at the top of the page here, it says Jen. So I'm going to put in John. John. And we'll go to John 1:1. Oh no, maybe we're not going to go to John 1:1. Oh, the internet started failing. It has. Oh, that's so frustrating. It's not going to work, is it? All right. Well, God doesn't want us to do Greek. That's going a bit too far. But what you would do, if you did want to do Greek, is so you go to his website, click John 1:1 if you were looking at John. So that would be an interesting verse, right? So the JWs, for instance, would look at that verse and say, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was a God. And you can look at that verse, and you go through it, and enarche, tein logos, or whatever. So it's in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was. And then you can see from the Greek that before the word theos again, it has the definite article, which in Greek is ho, which is the word the, which defines like a proper noun, which would be translated as God, big letter, not little letter God. So that's one thing. But also, I think what trumps the Greek even, because even Greek can have different renderings, context is more powerful in the Greek. When you read the context of John chapter 1, you see in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was, well, is it God or a God? But then you go down, you read a bit more, and it says, everything was made through the Logos. Nothing that has been made without the Logos. It's like, well, who made this world? It was God, capital G, you know? And then you go down, and you know, it was through full of faith, full of grace and truth, and we beheld his glory, the glory of the only begotten, full of grace and truth. So the context is, oh my goodness, it has to be talking about somebody who is fully God, but it is backed up by the Greek. I was going to take you to another verse as well, John 16 verse 8, which the NIV inexplicably translates as. Oh, has it just worked? Oh, perhaps it has caught up. Okay, so that's John 1:1. See there, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. So what you would do, there's lots of things you can click on, but I click on interlin, which is interlinear. And interlinear shows you the Greek alongside the English translation. So you can see every English word and what the Greek word for each English word is, but it'll do it for you in the order of the Greek. So I clicked interlinear, and it's not going to work. But that's how it works anyway. So you are?
My mother has an interlinear by
Interlinear, yeah.
It says the English and the Hebrew underneath.
Okay. Yeah, so that's, yeah. So basically it would go to another page, interlinear, and you'd see all the Greek words above the English words, and you can click on the number of the Greek word, and then it'll take you to another page where it gives you information about that word, what that word means. It'll tell you where it's used in the different parts of the Bible, and it'll tell you its different uses in the different parts of the Bible, because it can mean different things in different contexts. So I find that really, really helpful. And there's I was going to take you to John 16 verse 8 as well, where it talks about the Holy Spirit being sent, and when he comes, he will convict the world of sin, righteousness, and judgment to come. In the NIV, for some reason, it says when he comes, he will prove the world to be wrong about sin and righteousness and judgment to come. I was like, why is it say that doesn't have the same feeling of conviction at all. So why have they said that? It's just like people are wrong about it. No, it's conviction of the sin that they've committed. That's what the Holy Spirit does. It doesn't just prove them wrong. But check the Greek. First of all, you can check all the translations, because they were all there. all of them would use the word convict. So it's like, why is the NIV doing something different here? You check the Greek and you see that the word there is more about reproof or conviction, and it gives you explanations of how it's used elsewhere. And you're like, actually the NIV is a bad translation there. It does mean convict. And so I find that really helpful. And you may be looking at different verses, you come across a word and you think, oh, that sounds an interesting word. I wonder if I can get more information on that word. Check that website out, go to the verse, click interlinear, go where the actual word is next to the Greek and the number above the Greek, click on that number and it'll give you more information from different sources about that word and how it's used. It can be, at least for you, valuable in terms of you understanding what the individual verses mean, so that you know you're presenting the truth of the original text, not necessarily a translation that's got it a bit wrong. Is that okay?